Hi, I'm Dr. Selina Matthews, spiritual psychologist, and I want to welcome you all to Soul Transformation. My guest today is Dr. Lionel Corbet. He's a professor of depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He's a psychiatrist, a scholar, and an author of very many books. Our topic today is, are you spiritual but not religious? And if not, why? This is going to be a very stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. So please stay tuned. So excited, Dr. Corbet, to have you here in person. You are a legend. So I am totally thrilled. So I'm going to start with the question that we want in our topic immediately so we can get through in this time that we have. So what does it really mean to be spiritual and not religious? Because in our culture, people say, oh, I'm spiritual, but I don't think they really know what that means. I think they just say that. So as we go through this topic, I'm wondering if you could put a definition on what is spiritual and what is religious so that we can all be on the same page with that.
Yeah, well, being religious means adherence to one of the traditional historical communities like Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, or something like that. But it's possible to have a sense of the sacred. It's possible to have a sense of the mystery of life, that there's a background order and intelligence to the universe, without adhering to any of the traditional notions of God and traditional sacred texts and so on. And there are lots of people who've given up on the traditional historical religions, but they still have a personal sense that there's more to life than just everyday material reality. And that's what they mean when they say that they're spiritual. They're aware that there's a kind of sacred dimension, as it were, behind the scenes.
But I'm going to just clarify here. So when people say they're spiritual, that's going to mean they have an idea about it, but they're not connected to any religious tradition. Okay. And people who are religious are connected to a tradition. That's really good. That's great. I think that can really separate it for us. What is the traditional concept of God, and why does it not work in today's society?
Well, there are several reasons. The details depend on the tradition that you belong to, but broadly speaking, if you think of the major theistic traditions, the major traditions that believe in a creator God, they have the idea of a kind of benevolent, all-good, loving kind of sky father in a sort of heavenly realm who intervenes in history and who one can appeal to in prayer, that kind of thing. And they have all kinds of anthropomorphic images. In other words, they project human traits onto this image of God. It's really only a mental image. So that they talk about God as a king or a shepherd or, a father, or sometimes a mother. But those are human qualities that they project onto the way that they imagine God, what I call the God image.
I see.
And these concepts really, they're often not based on personal experience. They're just inherited ideas that we were told in Sunday school and in the family. So we just adopt them, often unthinkingly,
Well, it's interesting because many of my clients, don't believe in God. They are angry with God because of all the atrocities in the Ukraine. They're angry because of the mass shootings, and it's God's fault.
Yes, well, they repudiate the traditional idea of God as all loving and benevolent, because they say, how can a God be loving and benevolent in the face of all this suffering and evil that's going on in the world? And this is a very traditional problem for the traditions. They say that the problem is, if you have a God who's omnipotent, who can do everything, therefore this God could prevent suffering and evil. Obviously, he's not preventing suffering and evil, so how can you say he's all good? If he was all good, all this awful stuff wouldn't be happening. And so they feel disappointed because what they were told in Sunday school and in the family just doesn't work out for them. A lot of people give up on the traditional idea of God because, they've been told that God is good and loving all their life, and then they have some major life crisis or tragedy or something, and then they realize that that's just not true. They're like the biblical Job. They're apparently suffering, and they're innocent. They're suffering for no obvious reason. So they give up on the traditional images of God. They don't work.
Right. In America, Christianity is really declining. In
Mm-hmm.
1976, 91% of people related to as Christian. In 2016,
Mm-hmm.
73% related to as Christian. So there's, definitely a difference. And the
Mm-hmm.
other piece of this that I found is that 29% of American adults
Mm-hmm.
no longer have an official religious affiliation. And that I thought that was really high. And that was a recent Pew study. And
Mm-hmm.
it's being led by the Gen Zs and the millennials. And I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah.
So if organized religion is declining, what can replace it?
Well, what can replace it is the development of a personal spirituality, a sense that the individual is connected, that there is a spiritual dimension, that we are connected to it in some way, but it has to be an individual way. It has to be some way that works for the individual. It can't be based, for example, on just reading a sacred text like the Bible or something like that, or being given a creed, a set of beliefs, and being told what to believe. The whole temper of our times nowadays, we don't like being told what to believe. We don't like being given a list of what to believe. So the problem for the individual is, how do I relate to the sacred dimension without having to swallow what I was told to believe? And a lot of the traditional theological ideas, remember, began in the Bronze Age. I mean, that's when the Hebrew Bible begins to be written, and then Christianity starts to develop in the 4th century, and people. We have a very different consciousness now. Those people, of course, knew nothing about modern cosmology or quantum mechanics or depth psychology. We need a whole different way of thinking about the spiritual dimension. We can't just rely on these old ideas.
Yeah, because they don't work, and the up and upcoming populations have no interest in them.
No, and I find that young people in particular are very incredulous about all the miracle stories,
Mhm.
A lot of people, when they read, say, the New Testament, they don't really believe all those miracles happen. It's very difficult now for us moderns to believe that Jesus took demons out of somebody and put them into a herd of swine. We don't tend to warm to those kind of stories. And so these are what we now call mythic stories. They're legendary stories. We don't have to accept them as literal historical truth. The same goes for things like the Exodus from Egypt or the revelation at Mount Sinai. These are mythic stories. They shouldn't be. They have spiritual importance and psychological importance, but they're not literal history. And people are much less likely to believe them nowadays. We need something else.
Yeah, we definitely do. And I want you to talk about Jung's concept of God, the God
Mm-hmm.
within, because I think I'll let you talk about how that could really facilitate my clients and a lot of people that will be listening to this, because they need another form. And I think this could be a form that would be beneficial.
Okay, so what Jung talks about is, instead of thinking about God as some kind of transcendent being in a heavenly realm, think about God as what he calls the self, written with a capital letter S. In other words, not the personal self, like yourself and myself, but the divine self. And he says that's not located in some heaven, it's located deeply in our own psyche. He calls it the God within. And he says it manifests itself, it appears in our dreams and in what he calls synchronistic events, which we can talk about. Um, um, and the form that it takes, the kind of images and dream symbols that it produces are very individual. They may have nothing to do with biblical accounts of divinity, but the way you recognize them is that they have a very special emotional quality. And the word that he uses is that they have what he calls a numinous quality, which is a word that he borrowed from a theologian called Rudolf Otto. And the idea is that these experiences, if you can imagine, well, there are some good biblical examples of this. For example, Moses talking to God at the burning bush, or Saul on the road to Damascus, hearing Jesus' voice. Those would be two biblical examples of numinous experiences. They have the quality of being mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, awesome, dreadful. But Jung's point was that as well as those traditional examples that you find in the Bible, ordinary people, you and I, can have experiences with this quality. They may not take a Judeo-Christian or Islamic content, but they have this very powerful, mysterious, emotional quality of awe and dread and mystery. And they are experiences of the sacred or the holy, even though they don't take a traditional form. And what Jung said is that these are experiences of the God within. And he said that actually the psyche or the mind, it doesn't just have personal levels to it. It's rather like an iceberg. The personal level is just at the top.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a level below that, which is, repressed material from childhood that we can't remember. But there's a level below that, which is the spiritual dimension. And this is what distinguishes Jung's approach from other schools of psychology. And that's where this divine self is located. And sometimes that can appear in a dream, in a symbolic
Wow.
form.
Well, I want to tell people about your book, Psyche and the Sacred, which is extraordinary. In here, you have many examples
Mhm.
of numinous experiences. I want to ask you personally, can you tell me one of your numinous experiences? Because then people will really connect to you.
Okay. Well, I'll give you an early one. It took the form in the dream of a gigantic, unidentified flying object, like the one in Close Encounters,
What?
the movie.
Really? Wow.
Huge. This is dream, not I was not awake. So the way in the dream, this thing is gigantic and it's coming down, and it's hovering lower and lower, which is quite terrifying. It's
Yeah.
um, I don't know if it's going to stop. It just hovers a short distance above my head. Now that's pretty mysterious and awesome and dreadful in its own right. It made me absolutely terrified in the dream. And then bright lights shone down from the base of this UFO, and like searchlights. And when I looked up, I saw that the base of it was studded with uh, where there should have been the lens of the light were eyes, and the light was coming out of these eyes shining down on me. Now that meets all these criteria. It's mysterious, dreadful, awesome, and I was completely overwhelmed in the dream.
For
A
sure.
deeply powerful experience. But obviously, this is not a Judeo-Christian or Islamic image of God. But Jung would say that it is actually a symbol of the divine self manifesting itself psychologically in this very emotionally powerful way. But it wouldn't be accepted as an experience of the sacred or the holy by traditional religionists, because they would only accept orthodox
Or
manifestations.
yeah, more in a
So what's
box. Yeah.
important? Sorry. So what's important is the emotional quality of the experience, and people have these experiences in nature, in the wilderness, all kinds of other ways. And they may have, and sometimes they can actually contradict traditional teachings. And that's why the religious traditions don't like Jung's approach very much, many of them, because sometimes to claim that an experience like this is an experience of the sacred or the holy might contradict the official teaching about the way the divine is supposed to appear. So
Wow.
there's a bit of conflict here.
I would imagine that's quite an incredible numinous experience that you had. And don't you think many people have this, but people are afraid to speak about it
Yeah,
because it's very shocking? I mean,
that's
your experience is, you know, uh, just so incredible that it would shake you to your core, and so people would be afraid of these experiences or to talk about them because people would think they're crazy.
Yes, because people are not used to thinking of these terms, of these experiences as experiences of the sacred, because we've all been told that the way the divine appears is sort of in the traditional ways. So what Jung is talking about is really radically quite different, and it's giving people a new way to develop a personal spirituality that may have nothing to do with traditions. But people and these experiences can occur as a kind of visionary experience. You can have an experience where it's as if you're having a dream, but you're actually awake. So you see the image, whatever it is, out there instead of in a dream form. But people don't like to talk about this kind of thing because it makes you sound a little bit crazy or flaky or ungrounded. Um, but there are ways of distinguishing whether these are religious experiences or psychotic experiences.
How would you distinct? I mean, you're a renowned psychiatrist. How would you distinguish the difference between something that is psychotic and something that is numinous?
Um, well, it's actually a complicated question because um, what happens in psychosis is that people descend into this very deep, what we call the mythic level of the psyche. So that they are living in a dream world when they're psychotic. They're living in a mythic world. Their normal consciousness is overwhelmed by this kind of mythological imagery. Whereas the person who's healthier will go to that same mythic level of the psyche, have one of these kind of experiences, but then come back and be able to function normally in everyday reality, and live an ordinary life and have normal perceptions and normal thinking. But the person who has a psychotic experience is plunged into this dream world and can't get out of it. It's like they're living in a waking dream.
Wow.
So it's the same material, but the average person is healthier and is able to come back to normality.
Wow, that was really beautifully said. Thank you so much. You clarified a lot for me in that. Thank
Mhm.
you for that. Um, we also talk about many of my clients have synchronistic events,
Mhm.
and they they feel that that's connected to a different level or perhaps the divine.
Mhm.
People that have been working with, you know, psychologists like myself, uh, and there's quite a few of us because of Pacifica, that
Mhm.
when they come in and they talk about, I have all these synchronistic experiences. Um,
Mhm.
how can we help them to piece that together in a spiritual way?
Mhm. Well, should I begin by just briefly describing what a synchronistic event is, or
I
do you
think
think
that would
everybody?
be perfect. Yeah.
So, so the word synchronicity was based on was Jung's idea that sometimes something is going on in one's mind psychologically, And then something happens in the outer world, in the physical world, and the two things correspond to each other, but they don't cause each other. But they have the same meaning. So an example would be, imagine that you dream that somebody has died, and then the next morning you get a phone call and you're told that that person has died. Now, obviously, the physical event and the dream, which is a psychological event, don't cause each other, but they have the same meaning. And that so it's what Jung called acausal meaning. They don't cause each other. So the idea is that the physical and the psychological are arising from some deep unitary ground of reality where the physical realm and the psychological realm are really not divided. In our consciousness, sort of matter and spirit, or mind and matter, are divided, but Jung is postulating a deep level where they're not divided. And when that level emerges, we have one of these synchronistic events, and they're very powerful. They have this kind of meant to be quality, and they produce a very powerful sense of meaning. And they are spiritually very important. They make us realize that there is a deeper reality than our ordinary, everyday waking reality, and we participate in that. And these kind of synchronistic events tend to occur during emotionally heightened situations in life. You tend to see them around births and deaths and marriages and major events in one's life. They tend to produce these kind of synchronistic events, but they are manifestations of the very deep level of the psyche, deep level of reality that normally we don't have access to.
Yeah.
So they are very important spiritual events.
Yeah, I want to just talk briefly about. I had a client who came in just this week, and he was talking about he was feeling having all these dreams of incredible loss. Yesterday,
Mm,
he called me, and his brother, who was 45, died in his sleep.
mm,
And it was almost like he said, I knew something was going to happen because was having all these dreams of loss.
yeah,
And then, you
yeah,
know, he found his brother. Um,
yeah. Well, there are 2 points here. One is that when you have an intense, painful experience of loss like that, this is what Jung calls the dark side of the self. One of the ways that Jung's approach to spirituality differs from, say, a traditional Christian approach is that the Christian idea of God is that God is largely loving and benevolent. Um, like the first letter of John says, he is only light and in him there is no darkness. That kind of feeling. Jung thinks that's an incomplete way of thinking about God. And if you look at things like, say, the Holocaust or what's going on in Ukraine now, or a personal loss like the death of a loved one, Jung thinks these are produced by what he calls the dark side of the self. And he wants to have a God image which is not only loving and light, but which is also responsible for darkness and evil and suffering. He thinks, and also it must have a feminine aspect. One of his criticisms of the Christian God image is that it was too exclusively masculine. It didn't include the feminine aspects of the divine, which are very important. That's another way that Jung's notion of the self as the God within is a little bit, well, more than a little, incompatible with traditional Christianity. Um, so one has to. So I'm thinking of a story like the biblical Job. Job was an apparently innocent man who suffered from terrible losses because God was having a bet about whether he would remain pious in the face of loss. It's really a kind of a very strange story. But we can all be Job at times, we can all suffer apparently through no fault of our own. So your patient is in a situation like the biblical Job. He's suffering for no apparent reason. So Jung would say that's the dark side of God that he's experiencing.
and then it manifests with his brother.
In this case, as loss, yes. But your other point that he seemed to know that something was going to happen is very important because these are what are called this kind of knowing. And there are all kinds of, sometimes these are called anomalous experiences or parapsychological experiences, like clairvoyance or telepathy or knowing that something is going to happen before it happens. These are good evidence for the fact that the psyche, this deep level of the psyche that Jung talks about, which other schools don't believe in, by the way, connects all human beings. We are all linked in that deep level, just as Jung says, it's the same self, the same divinity in all of us. So that when you have this kind of knowing, you are in tune with a deep level of the psyche that has knowledge that the ordinary consciousness doesn't have. And that's his explanation for these kind of parapsychological occurrences.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. That was a beautiful way of bridging the two. You briefly talked about visionary experiences. How
Mm-hmm.
are they specifically different than numinous experiences? And can you have visionary experiences internally or externally? Can you extrapolate on those areas?
Yeah. Well, a visionary experience is rather like having a dream, except that you're awake. Okay. I mean, if you can imagine Moses talking to God, speaking to him out of a burning bush, assuming that wasn't a dream, which it may have been, but one can have these kind of waking experiences where you see something out there which perhaps nobody else can see, like the children who saw visions of the Blessed Virgin Mary. Those kind of experiences, they're not uncommon, but people very often are reluctant to talk about them. Because when you say I had a vision, it makes you sound rather crazy. So people are often reluctant to talk to their therapist about this kind of thing for fear of sounding hysterical or, and if you're a therapist who doesn't believe in a spiritual dimension, and the incidence of atheism among therapists and psychologists is higher than it is in the general population.
Really?
So, oh yes. So
Oh
if you
my God.
went to a therapist,
I did not
if you
know
went
that.
because they like to think of themselves as scientists, and nowadays that for most people means materialism. It means there is nothing there. What it's called naturalism. They don't believe in anything supernatural. So if you like to think of yourself as a scientist and you only believe in physical reality, and someone comes in and says, "I had a vision," the therapist is going to think, "Well, what were you smoking?" Or this was hysterical, or a brief hallucination or something. But if you are the kind of therapist that realizes that there is a spiritual dimension, then you can say, well, you had an experience of this transpersonal spiritual level of the psyche, and it was so powerful that it couldn't be contained inside you. I mean, you can have inner vision like this, or sometimes it just is too powerful and it gets projected out.
Wow.
And these things, I've talked to many people who've had these kind of experiences, and they're reluctant to talk about them.
Dr. Corbett, have you ever had a personal vision?
Yes, I've had one very powerful visionary experience of this kind, um, and it's a very good example of the idea that, regardless of the religious tradition that one is raised in, that one can experience a god or a goddess from another tradition. So in this experience, I was lying in bed, and I know I was not asleep. I was wide awake. And suddenly I had the experience of a figure by the side of my bed, and it was tall and gray. And that was very terrifying. And when I looked at the figure, it had three faces. It was looking down at me. It had three faces. It had a face looking down and a face on either side of its head. It was an extremely terrifying experience. and it meets all those criteria that I talked about: mysterious, fascinating, tremendous, awesome, dreadful, and so on. And it was quite transient, and I had absolutely no idea what it meant. Um, so I knew what I had to do. I knew that I hadn't been smoking anything. I wasn't using any drugs. I wasn't temporarily psychotic or something. So this, fortunately, knowing Jung's psychology, I realized that somehow I'd had a brief dip into this mythopoetic level of the psyche, and this was a mythological figure that had appeared. Um, so what one does in this situation is go to the library and try to locate the figure in world mythological systems. Well, it turns out that when you do that, there are lots of gods and goddesses and figures in world mythology that have either three heads or three faces. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I decided that this particular one was the ancient god Hermes Mercury from Greco-Roman mythology.
Really?
Yes, and he was a herald god. When the gods on Olympus wanted to send a message, they would use him to send the message. And and shortly after this vision appeared, I became very ill. So I understood in retrospect that this was a kind of warning that something was about to happen. It was kind of a message from the self, the biggest self, as it were. So that's an example of a personal visionary experience.
Well, that's quite
Um,
that's quite extraordinary. I mean, I can't even imagine, how intense you must have felt when you saw um, that being.
well, it was at the time, of course, it was terrifying, and these things are deeply mysterious. And when you talk to somebody about this kind of experience, you have to be careful who you talk to.
I would agree.
So even if your audience has had this kind of experience, I'd be very careful about who you talk to about this. Um, but they are very important. They are very good evidence that there is this spiritual dimension, and that it doesn't care what your own religious tradition is. That's why Jung says you can't Christianize the unconscious. This deep mythopoetic level will produce imagery that you need. It doesn't necessarily produce an image from your own tradition. So, for example, and as I said before, it can contradict a tradition. I've heard a dream not long ago in which Jesus appeared as a woman.
Really?
Yes, and when that person talked to her minister about it, the minister said, "Oh well, that dream was sent by the devil to deceive you," which is a very fundamentalist approach. What Jung would say, no, this is a symbolic manifestation that's telling the dreamer that the divine has a feminine aspect and shouldn't be thought of as exclusively masculine. That's the way one has to interpret this kind of material. But
Yeah.
it's confusing to people when they don't have this concept of the deep level of the psyche.
No, absolutely. And just on an aside, one of the major singers, I think Christine Aguilera, just did a perfume, God is a Woman, out this for this season. God is a Woman. Yep.
Well, God isn't either a man or a woman, but anyway.
So there's a commercial aspect, coming out here. It's fascinating the different tracks that are happening simultaneously in our culture.
But we have to get rid of this notion that you can get to God through conceptual thought.
Right.
You can only really have this kind of symbolic experience of it.
Right. Oh,
That's why paying attention to dreams is very important, because they're always surprising. You never know what's going to show up.
yeah.
And it may not take a traditional form. And it has nothing to do with conceptual thinking and ideas that you have. It's always completely surprising.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. Now, do you think dreams are a form of spiritual practice?
Absolutely, yes. Because dreams, in this model that in Jung's model, dreams are made by the self. They are like messages from the self, from the inner divine. And I mean, the notion that dreams are sent by the divine is a very, very ancient idea. It goes back way into antiquity, and of course, it's important in the Bible. You know, in the New Testament, you know, Joseph is warned in a dream, told that Mary's conceived of the Holy Spirit in a dream, warned about Herod in a dream. So they used to be very, very important in the Christian tradition, but for various reasons that I could explain if you want, they went out of fashion in Christianity. But they are spiritually very important, and this is a spiritual practice to work with one's dreams.
Wow, it's I've been doing it for decades, and I'm so attached to my inner world, and I
Mm-hmm.
try to teach that to my clients because I mean, I think it's so important that you understand yourself
Mm-hmm.
on deep levels. So, as we're continuing on, what do you think are the benefits of spirituality in general?
Well, there's some well-known benefits. You know, the sense of comfort is very important. Um, Spirituality tends to be people who have a strong spiritual sense tend to be less likely to use drugs or alcohol to excess.
Really?
Yes,
Hmm.
yes, that's not, and of course the community aspect is helpful. If you belong to a spiritual community, the support that you get from the community is very important. Uh, and you get if you work with dreams, for example, you get guidance from dreams. So that's also very helpful for one. Um, one doesn't feel alone. Like my dream of the UFO with the eyes looking at me was a distinct. The dreams often give a message. The message there was you are seen by the self. Something is aware of you. Well, that's a very comforting, very important idea.
Absolutely, absolutely, definitely. Um, yeah, and in our society and culture at large, we need that deeply because there's so much chaos in the world at this point. When you run into people that are agnostic, agnostic or atheist, and they don't believe in God, or they don't know if there is a God, what do you
Mhm.
say to them, or how do you work with them? Because I mean, there could have been some that were in your practice, or
Yeah, mostly what's happened to them is, I mean, some of them are atheists or agnostic on intellectual grounds. They don't think there's enough evidence
hmm,
for the existence of God, or they think the evidence is equivocal. Um, Other people were raised in a religious tradition, but they've been disappointed because they've been told about God, that God is loving and benevolent and protective, and then some tragedy happens. So their faith has been undermined because they've been given an image of God that doesn't work for them. And this is an important aspect of Jung's approach because Jung pointed out that belief by itself is not enough. Belief, just being told what to believe or believing in a creed or something, can be easily undermined by life events that undermine your belief system. But if you've had a direct experience, like one of these powerful dreams or visions that we've been talking about, that's not a question of belief any longer. Then when you've had the experience, you know. You don't need to believe, it's knowledge. That's why when Jung was asked, do you believe in God? He said, I don't believe, I know. Because if you've had the direct experience, it's not a matter of belief anymore. So many people who call themselves atheists have given up on the traditional God image. They have nothing to replace it with. Um, uh, and they don't understand that by going in this direction, the depth psychological direction, they can have a direct experience through working with dreams and so on. But that idea hasn't really penetrated into the community at large.
Wow.
And in academic circles and mainstream psychotherapy training programs, this material is not taught. Jung is very marginalized.
Right.
Again, because they're trying to be scientific, and this is not the kind of thing that you can measure with an instrument or quantify.
No.
So because of that, this is just not a popular approach in mainstream circles.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, are there certain practices, spiritual practices, that you could suggest to the audience that they can begin to, or, encourage them to develop?
Well, that's really a very individual question. It depends on the person's temperament, and I certainly could recommend dream work and paying attention to synchronistic events. I recommend keeping a dream journal every morning, write down the dream from the night before, that kind of stuff. But I wouldn't like to make a general recommendation of things like prayer or meditation, because that's too individual. Those practices are good for some people and not good for other people.
Yeah.
So I think I'd rather leave it at that.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the final question. Are you spiritual? Is that what you call yourself, spiritual? Or,
Yeah,
where do you see yourself in this?
well, in the sense that I try to pay attention to this spiritual dimension of the psyche by paying attention to the way it shows up in my life in the form of synchronistic events and dreams and that kind of thing. And of course, I work with a lot of other people who are doing this kind of work. And when one hears this kind of story of other people's dreams and visionary experiences, one's sense of a spiritual background dimension is constantly being reinforced. So actually doing this work as a practice, as a psychotherapy practice, or working in dream groups, that is my spiritual practice, actually.
Wow. Well, you are incredible. I am so blessed to have you here, Dr. Corbet. I really am. Thank you for this beautiful discussion on spirituality, and I so appreciate you and appreciate that you were able to do this with me. So I thank you so very much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.